everyone, so this is the ribbon dress. I have been adoring these ribbons of the curves and everything. Yeah, since I saw them in Threads magazine over a year ago. I made my first one. It's very exciting, isn't it? I made my first one about a year ago, absolutely fell in love with it, and I've been experimenting with these curves, just taking them more and more and more. I've done a bonnet and a bloomers, and this whole pattern just sort of evolved. Yeah, that's right. Everly's very excited about it too. But I do want to give a warning about this because this is going to be unlike patterns I've released in the past. There is some intuitive pieces to this. You can make it work, but there's little bits of pieces of like having to make it work. So it's not for beginners. It's not for like if you want to run something in your machine and be done with it. I'll catch you in the next one. It's not one of those patterns, okay? So I always want to be very upfront, transparent. I never want you guys to have something, to get something and just have buyer's remorse or like be pulling your hair out or frustrated. I don't want any of that. So it's a labor of love and it's doable, but yeah, I just want to put all that out there. Please watch the video in its entirety before purchasing the pattern, and at the end of the video you're confused by it, this is the best instructions that I can do. So by the end of the video if you're confused by it, like I said, it's just not a pattern for you, and I will catch you with the next one. So there are basically two versions of this pattern, two gowns, okay, two structures we're going to go over. And that can lead to a variety of dresses. Everything from a diaper shirt for the gown number 1. If you make it a dress version, you can make it a long christening gown, and then gown number 2, you can make a dress or a christening gown depending on where you stop that. Okay, I think they're just the curves just speak to me. I absolutely love them. So okay, so gown number 1 has gentle curves, and that can be shortened to a diaper shirt. And then you have the full-on circle skirt, complete labor of love, 360-degree skirt of gown number 2. And this is not for the faint of heart. But the gentle curves of gown number 1, those come together quite easily. So you can either apply ribbon or strips of bias fabric. There are actually some other options we're going to go over, but those are the two ones that I touched on. There are pros and cons to all of this. The bias strips of fabric take a little bit more time since you have to cut, the bias strips out in most cases, but they open up, well, one, they bend so well, but they also open up lots of options of pairing different fabrics together, salads together or prints or something. I did a Liberty diaper shirt with some strips on it, and I think that's just absolutely, it's just a fun little pattern. So is the light really exciting? Is that it? So then there's the ribbon, and I used silk ribbon, which was not on the bias, and that was a super easy method since you just, it just comes and you just use it as is. There's no cutting or folding or marking or nothing. You just go and use the ribbon. So it does not bend as well as the bias strips do, but it bends good enough, and you'll have a little bit of ripples while you're sewing it, but as soon as you iron the ribbon, it will just relax into place, the ripples will go away, and all is well in the world. So I just want to lay that out there, and of course the best of both worlds would be bias ribbon, okay? So like seam binding would be a neat idea, and then there's spaghetti tubing like this farmhouse sells, and they have 1/4 inch space, or it's a 1/4 inch width, so you could do that instead. The pattern is 1/2 inch with 1/4 inch spacings, but you could just flip them, right, or whatever, and we'll get into that more. So lots of different options for this pattern, just kind of a take it and run with it sort of thing. But it's also why it's not for, one of the reasons it's not for, I would say it's not for beginners. So if you're going to go the fabric bias route, then you will cut 1.5 inch wide bias strips. And you can either sew them together if you want to save on fabric, but then you'll have those little seam marks. So if that bothers you, then you can cut, pieces that are long enough to stretch from one side to the other side of the gown and not have those seams. One continuous strip of fabric, right? Bias strip. And I found it helpful to just mark one side at the 1/4 inch mark, and you're going to mark this on the wrong side of the fabric. And you can mark both sides at the 1/4 inch mark, but I didn't find that necessary, and I will explain more in a little bit. Sweet girl. And so you've got plenty of options, right? You've got the ribbon, the bias strip of fabric that you can cut out. You've got seam binding, French lace would be gorgeous, lace tape would be really pretty. So many different options. So whatever you've picked out, now how do you apply it? Well, with gown number 1, you can use freezer paper because it's small enough that you can use a piece of freezer paper and it doesn't, become a hot mess in a hurry. This is actually how Threads magazine explains how to do the technique. They use freezer paper, and if you've been to my channel before, you know I absolutely adore this stuff for smocking to secure the pleats down as you sew over top of them. So when I saw that Threads magazine was recommending this to keep the body of the dress, that fabric down, from wiggling on you, I was like, yes, freezer paper, I love this stuff. And I'm not crazy because they love it too, right? So anyway, so if you're going the freezer paper route, then you will trace the lines onto the matte side of the freezer paper and then iron the glossy side of the freezer paper to your fabric. And you want to avoid this glossy side from touching your iron. So first put the fabric down, then the glossy side of the freezer paper, and then you can put wax paper between that and your iron so the iron is not touching the glossy side of the freezer paper. And you can iron everything into place. And this will secure your fabric from moving on you, from wiggling all around, and it will allow you to keep things more accurate. So from there, you could base the freezer paper together with the fabric, or you could use some like water-soluble thread or something, or you can simply pin the freezer paper to your fabric. See, the thing with the freezer paper is that yes, it's now adhered because of you've ironed it, but if you tug on it, as you're working the gown and stuff, if you tug and stuff, the two will come apart. You can iron the two back together, but to keep it temporary together, pins or some temporary basting are good to do. I did pins. And then you can apply the strips of fabric. So if you're doing the ribbon, it's just a matter of, putting one side down, following the curve of one edge, top stitching, curving that as you go, and then going to the other side and top stitching. If you're using the bias strips of fabric, then you'll put the fabric right sides together with your fabric, lining up the 1/4 inch mark that you've made on the fabric to the bottom edge of the curve marked along your freezer paper. Then you'll stitch securing that bottom edge down, and then fold the top edge of the fabric under a 1/4 inch until it lines up with the other mark on your freezer paper. And this is why I didn't feel the need to mark that other 1/4 inch on my fabric strip, because I'm just using the 1/4 inch on my freezer paper, right? So you can definitely mark both 1/4 inches if you want to, but I didn't feel that necessary, and that's why. So once that 1/4 inch, that top 1/4 inch has been turned under, you can top stitch that down in place. So I also tried this whole method as I was going through the last year of trying this and that. I also tried using water-soluble stabilizer in lieu of the freezer paper. But I like the freezer paper better overall. It does a really great job securing your base fabric down so it doesn't wiggle on you. Whether that's the base fabric of your bonnet or your dress or bloomers, whatever, so it does not wiggle around on you. And the other thing I really like is that you don't have to soak the freezer paper. Yes, you have to pull it away gently, and that can be a bit of a mess, but there's pros and cons to both. There's no perfect thing with this, but with the water-soluble stabilizers, you've got to absolutely drench your fabric, and then you've got to deal with the wrinkles that come from drenching your fabric, right? So, like I said, there's no perfect method. Even the freezer paper method, there's some cons to it. Okay, so what about that full circle skirt of gown number 2? Well, things get a little bit more tricky here. I tried using freezer paper, but joining a bunch together, but the gown is just too big. The circle skirt it becomes a huge hot mess in a hurry. So I scrapped that idea. Instead, I heavily starched my fabric, trying to add some stiffness to it. And then I pinned my pattern piece, and I began tracing. And for the first time I did this, I traced every single curve. And looking back, it seems so obvious. You should not do this, okay? Do not trace every single curve, because as you're tracing it, the fabric is moving a little bit, it's wiggling, and every single line is getting more off, and it looks like, as I'm looking back, I'm like, hindsight is 20/20. I should not have done this, but I did do it with the first time I did this, and such is life. So here I'm tracing the cut line, the sewing line, like where that waist seam is going to go, and the top of the first curve. So before attaching anything, I stage stitch on that cut circle mark, and this is where I'll cut around once I'm done with the ribbon work. So I attach the ribbon by starting out with the same spot on the dress, and I will sew this spot into the back of the dress, so all those little pieces go into the back side of the skirt. So I let the raw edge of the ribbon hang over about 1/4 of an inch, and I top stitch along the top edge of the ribbon, and then I cut an extra 1/4 of an inch as I got to the end of the row. And I turned that under and sewed down that vertical little bit and continue to sew at the bottom edge of the ribbon. And then you can just eyeball your seam allowance to offset the additional ribbons, that 1/4 of an inch mark. You can measure it and pin it in place. I also did try doing that. You can also measure it and do the sew line glue pin. I did that. I really liked that method, but my sew line glue pin was at the end of its little bit. I ran out of it. So then I just eyeballed it, and it was surprisingly easy. It stayed quite accurate, and this is the method that I would recommend if you're doing this gown. So you can either measure it, pin it in place, measure and sew line glue pin it, or you can just eyeball it. I would recommend doing one of those three when doing gown number 2. So with this silk ribbon not being on the bias, you'll have a little bit of rippling, as I mentioned earlier, as you are sewing it. But after you iron it, it will just relax into place, the rippling will go away, and all will be well with the world. Yeah! Hi! So you can do this process with the bias strips of fabric as well. First you will want to iron under both raw edges 1/4 of an inch, and then you'll basically use the same method as we just did with the ribbon. You're just ironing under those 1/4 inch marks first, and then treating it like we did with the ribbon. So to do the hem of the circle skirt, I first stage stitch around the bottom of the hem, and then I trimmed up very close to those stitches, and I used those stitches to turn the fabric up. I would iron it up first and then pin that iron edge to the ribbon and just keep repeating that until I got all the way around. And then I'm going to top stitch the bottom of the ribbon. Yeah, is that funny? Which will join the fabric together, and that raw edge of the fabric will be sandwiched on the inside of the ribbon. Isn't that neat? I love the way this little hem came together. Yeah, I was excited about it too. I just think it looks so cool, and it's like you have a ribbon that finishes the bottom of the hem out. So it's just really pretty. So there's many different routes to take with these curves, many different things that can be used for the curve, whether it's ribbon, it's fabric, bias fabric strips, it's seam binding, the spaghetti strips, French lace, lace tape, a number of different things. You can just take it and run with it. Lots of different ways to get those lovely curves into place. But now that they are into place, we can move on to the constructions. Like I said, there are 2 basic views on this pattern, as I mentioned earlier. So let's first construct gown number 1, that A-line dress, which is the same process for the diaper shirt, just shorter. So you'll join the shoulder seams together using French seams. And if you want to make your garment sleeveless, like I did with this diaper shirt, then you'll just join a bias strip of fabric so you can finish that arm side. And then I joined the side seams together of the diaper shirt using a French seam. And I also used a piece of bias strip fabric to finish off the neckline. And finally, she's so giggly. And finally, I put a placket using the continuous placket method, and voila, you have a little sleek diaper shirt. But what if you want to do, and you could do the same thing, right, with a dress, just make it longer, and you have a sleeveless dress. But what if you want to do the little bell-like sleeves, like on this lovely white version? Well, first you'll join the shoulder seams together using French seams. You'll also join the side seams together of the dress using French seams. And then you'll apply those little strips to the sleeve. So if you're using fabric strips, you'll put the fabric strip right sides together with the sleeve and sew along that 1/4 inch mark. And then I understitched this seam to the fabric of the dress side. And finally, I folded the top 1/4 inch of the fabric strip down and top stitched that in place. The same method, right, that we just went over to apply the fabric strips, those bias strips, to the bottom curves of that gown. Same method. Then I cut a piece of fabric on the bias that was 7/8 of an inch wide, and I marked the bottom of the strip at that 1/4 inch mark that we've been using, stitched that along to the sleeve as marked, and then the same thing, doing the same thing with the curves of the skirt that we just went over, and I folded the top edge down that 1/4 inch and top stitch down in place. And now I'm going to use this as a little casing for some elastic to sort of cinch in that part of the sleeve, making it look like a bell shape. Now you could also put in like little tiny buttonholes or something, eyelets, whatever, and then feed a ribbon through and tie the ribbon down to, cinch in that part of the sleeve. I think that would look very pretty too. So from there, I ran 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top of the sleeve and inserted the sleeve using a French seam. Finally, I inserted a placket using the continuous placket method, and then I attached a bias strip to the neckline, and voila, you have this lovely white version. But what about the other sleeves, the overlapping ones, those tulip sleeves? Well, it's a similar process to the sleeves we just went over. You'll hem the bottom of the sleeves the same way, taking a bias strip, sewing it right sides together with the sleeve at the 1/4 inch mark, turning that around and understitching, and then turning it to the top, and then turning the top of the bias strip down that 1/4 inch and top stitching in place. And you'll do that for both sides of the sleeve, making sure to turn the sleeve over so you have one of each side, right? You don't have a duplicate of one side, 2 of one side, so you have one of each, right? Am I saying that right? So then you'll join the bottom of the sleeve together using a French seam, and from there you'll line up the 2 sleeves at the mark directed by the pattern piece, and I just pinned that in place. Then I ran 2 rows of gathering threads at the top of the now joined sleeves, and I adjusted the gathers and installed the sleeve using a French seam. And then I completed the dress with a placket using the continuous placket method and a bias strip of fabric around the neckline. So now we can move on to gown number 2. So you'll join the bodice pieces together using that bodice ring method. So to do this, you'll sew the shoulder seams together, right sides together, so it goes front, back, joining all those pieces together at the shoulder seams. From there, you can put the bodice fronts right sides together and sew around the neckline. And if you want it to be sleeveless, you can also sew around those arms eyes. And if you sewed around the arms eyes for the sleeveless look, then you can pull the backs of the bodice through the front of the bodice to turn everything right sides out. And before attaching the skirt, you'll join the side seams of the bodice. And to do this, you'll open up the side seams and sew along with right sides together. With right sides together from the outside of the dress over the bottom of the arm's eye and continue down to the lining side of the bodice. If you want sleeves though, then follow one of the 2 sleeve options mentioned earlier in the video after you sew the side seams of the bodice together using plain seams. So you'll have one seam for the outside of the bodice and one seam for the lining side. These are 2 separate seams. Hope that makes sense, right? 2 separate seams. Then you'll attach the sleeves using a French seam. Okay, we are so close. We are so close. So before attaching the skirt to the dress, you'll have to install a placket into the skirt, and I would recommend using the continuous placket method to do this. I did this 2 different ways, one with fabric like the continuous placket method normally calls for, and then I did this with using the ribbon as the piece for the placket, and I think that looks so pretty. It's just a neat little touch. Either way, just put a continuous placket or put a placket in there using the continuous placket method, and make sure that placket's in the back where like the little joining of your fabric strips or your ribbon or whatever. Make sure it's back in line with that. Okay, so all that's at the back of your dress. So then you'll put 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top of the skirt, one on either side of where that waist seam is going to go, and adjust the gathers until they're evenly distributed, they match the bodice, all of that good gestures, right? And then you'll join just the top of the, like just the outside of the bodice. So leave the lining out. You'll join the outside of the bodice, the right side of the bodice, to the right side of the skirt, leaving that lining portion of the bodice out. And you'll sew the 2 together. And then you'll conceal this waist seam by turning the raw edge of the lining under, ironing that down in place, and hand sewing it into place later on. And that conceals the raw edge of the waist seam, and voila, you are done with gown number 2. Just an absolute labor of love. I keep saying it, it's not for the beginner. It's a bit intuitive. There's a little bit of a make it work thing with this. Lots of different options to go with it though. So if you're somebody who is like, you're just confused at the end of the video, please don't buy the pattern. I don't want you to be frustrated with me. I can't explain it any better than what I've done here. Maybe I could explain it, maybe it could be a little less chaotic, but I have a baby all the time, but that's okay. That's okay. That's just life right now. But if the concepts are not clicking to you, I will catch you in the next one. But if you're someone who's like, oh my god, the curves are so inspiring, I just want to do this, whether you're doing like, the diaper shirt is quite easy, or you're going all the way and doing a big old christening gown, and I'm excited to see everyone's makes on this. There's just so many different ways you can take it, run with it, make it your own. Maybe we'll say bye guys, I need to go take me a nap. Alright, thanks for watching, and I will hope to catch you on the next one.